Welcome to the final week of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam from the 8th century to the present day. In 2014, President Obama said this at a United Nations speech. It is the task of all great religions to accommodate devout faith with a modern multicultural world. No children anywhere should be educated to hate other people. And so one reason for this class is to help us understand the roots and the growth of these three Western religions, perhaps in some way to reduce the amount of misunderstanding and tension in the world, and at least among whatever position we hold, whether it's a religious or non-religious position, and those who are different from us. So let's look first at the Middle Ages, which is more or less from about 700, we could even go back to about 500 to about 15 or 1600. So remember the amazing speed of Islam and the growth in the middle 8th century, coming from the western part of the Arabian Peninsula, moving all the way out into Andalusia, Afghanistan, and northwest Africa. You've seen this slide already, but there's the great high point of medieval Islam, people like Al-Farabi, Ibn Avicenna, Averroes in political philosophy and science, the development of optics, alchemy, and physics, in history, general philosophy, and rational theology, as well as mysticism with people like Al-Ghazali. So if we look more particularly at that, there was this golden age in the Muslim world for the development of astronomy, medicine, and mathematics. In the late 700s, paper replaced parchment, which meant that books and writings could be produced with greater expanse. They could be more produced, that is, and thus distributed more broadly. There was a development of algebra, which is attributed to Al-Khwarizmi from 790 to 850. As I mentioned before, Averroes and Avicenna integrated the Islamic teaching with Plato and Aristotle, the Greek philosophers. And in this, they interacted with Jewish and Christian scholars, partly because of this particularly interesting connection in the area around Spain of Muslims, Jews, and Christians. The expanse of Islam, of that early expanse, was stopped by Charles Martel. Charles Martel is actually how you might pronounce it in French. Martel means the hammer, at the Battle of Tours in 732 of the Common Era. So as far as expanding into Europe, that was stopped with Charles Martel, who was the father of Charlemagne. Then we could think up a couple, 300 years about to the famous or infamous Crusades. In October of 1009, the Caliph Al-Haim bi-Amir Allah ordered the destruction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. And that was part of a destruction of Christian worship sites in Palestine and Egypt of the time. So that region, which we think of as the Holy Land today, and Egypt as well, had come under Islamic rule for centuries. The weakened Byzantine Empire, that was moved, the Roman Empire, which was moved to Constantinople as its head, was just too weak to hold those and too far away in many ways. But this seemed to be a tipping point for Christendom, for Christian leaders in Europe. And in 1095, the First Crusade was initiated by Pope Urban. He captured Jerusalem in 1099. And through various battles, he lost it again to the famous Saladin in 1187. So it was about 100 years of Christian rule of that area, but then, especially Jerusalem, but then lost again. And the last Christian stronghold, Tripoli, was retaken by Muslims in 1289. So the Crusades have their own fabulous and intricate and sometimes horrific history. But let it be said that in that period, ultimately, the Muslim world retook the area around what we think of as the Holy Land. And then in 1453, Constantinople was captured, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, as I mentioned, which I'll get to more specifically a little bit later. In the 16th century, Catholics were battling Protestants in Europe, which weakened the Christian response to the Islamic advance from the East. And so Suleiman the Great, the Magnificent, as he was called, took Belgrade in 1521, but he was stopped at Vienna in 1529. So let's think then about the European or Christian perspective. Of course, we all know about Columbus in 1492 to 1503. He set sail to what he thought was India, which of course is a reason that the native people of our country were called Indians at the time, and still are to this day by many people. And he set forth 4 voyages between Spain and the Americas. In 1519 to 1522, Ferdinand of Magellan circumnavigated, as it's called, the globe, went around the globe. And as Daniel Brown comments, no navigable port on earth was out of the range of European navies and merchant ships. And this is really important to take in, that it was science that allowed for this to emerge. So, as I've mentioned in the course, my particular interest and area of research is in the relationship of science and religion. And here is where science had such an amazing and powerful effect on religion. Think of Copernicus, whose dates are 1473 to 1543, and Galileo from 1562 to 1642. They were key players in the development of modern science, so that when another Ottoman army comes in 1683 to take over Vienna, they were driven back at the Battle of Vienna by the European troops. And again, as Daniel Brown comments, in a decisive way, enough way, it showed that Islam was falling behind European armies in technology and tactics, technology being the outgrowth of scientific advances. Let's look then at the 3 great Islamic empires, historically speaking, and where they were in the 1600s. You can see on the map the different colors. There's the Safavid Empire, which is in Persia. It's the Shiite Empire. That was weakening. The Mughal Empire, primarily in India, eventually succumbed to the British Empire's invasion. And then the Ottomans were the last really to fall, centered in Turkey, and they fell to the west in World War I, and they split. They fell apart. Let's look then at the Ottomans. Famous Ottoman emperors. Osman I, 1258 to 1326. In Arabic, he's called Uthman. He is the first Ottoman Empire leader. So the Ottomans, again, centered in what we would today see as Turkey, and they would be the Sunni, the center of Sunni Islam. Then there's the Mehmet II from 1432 to 1481, and thinking about that from the perspective we often think about in the United States, this is just before the time of Columbus, so you can imagine the perceived need to expand and to create better means of war as Mehmet is conquering Constantinople in 1543, which he renamed as Istanbul, or which means the city. And it was the capital of the Ottoman Empire until it fell in 1923. And then the high point of the Ottoman Empire is Suleiman the Great, 1494. Interesting, again, to compare that to what was happening with Ferdinand and Isabella sending out Columbus. His date's 1494 to 1566, and he was pushed back from Vienna in 1529. There was also strife and expansion in the Muslim Empire. So let's think about this in relationship among different branches of Islam. In 1501, the radical Shiite Sufi order conquered Tabriz, now in Iran, near Azerbaijan and the Caspian Sea. The Ismaili became the leader of the Safavid Empire with Twelver Shi'ism as the creed. I've talked about Twelver Shi'ism in the past. It's one branch of the Shia form of Islam. Believes that there's 12 imams, with the last being in occultation. And they seem to want the destruction of Sunni Islam. So this was a new element in the history of Muslim history, because traditionally Muslims would not move against other Muslims. That's why they kept to get more land. They would move west into Europe. But here we see a Shia-Sunni conflict, and Daniel Brown, the commentary on Islam, writes it this way: the almost complete predominance of Twelver Shiism in modern Iran and southern Iraq is largely Shah Ismaili's doing. In 1514, he found defeat at the hands of the Ottoman leader Sultan Selim, ending the Shiite expansion, which began what we know today as the sharp divide between Sunnis and Shiites. And so in contemporary politics in the Middle East, we see often warfare between these two branches, which really had not existed in this form. Babur defeated the Muslim rulers at Delhi in 1526 and initiated the Mughal Empire. His grandson Akbar, 1556 to 1605, expanded the empire to include most of the Indian subcontinent. What do we mean by this term Mughal? Well, as Nicholas Geyer tells us, it comes from a mispronunciation of the word Mongol, but the Mughals of India were mostly ethnic Turks, not Mongolians. However, Babur, whom I just mentioned, whose dates are 1483 to 1530, the first Mughal emperor could trace his blood back to Genghis Khan. So interesting to think about these three empires. Again, the Safavid or Shiite, the Ottoman or Sunni, and the Mughal Empire in India. Let's move then back to the Middle Ages in Christian Europe. Again, the Middle Ages you could broadly think of as the 5th century of the Common Era to 1500 of the Common Era. I mentioned it could be 700, it could be 1600. These dates are a little broad. Nobody was putting down a flag and saying, now we start the Middle Ages, now we end the Middle Ages. These are ways to understand huge shifts in history. But the big thing is the fall of the Roman Empire at the end of the 5th century. For example, the Germanic warrior Odoacer deposed and exiled the Emperor Ramus Augustus in 476 CE from Rome. And in the 1500s, we begin to see the Renaissance. We see humanism, the rise of what it means to be human as an example of God's great creation and the master, the key of creation, the crown of creation, explored by the humanist and scientist and artist Michelangelo. I'll mention Luther and Calvin, who begin the tradition of Protestantism, which is its own often era of the Reformation, but it comes out of this Renaissance humanism and then the flowering of Western sciences. So let's just pause for some questions, because the American experience comes out of these two movements of Renaissance humanism, the scientific revolution, and as well the Protestant Reformation. What happens? What makes American religion unique? And as we move then into the expanse into the United States, what we know as the United States today, what has happened in the last 400 years that has changed the way we view religion in general, and what do we do with the rise of religious non-affiliation and atheism today? All right, back to medieval Christianity. We've seen some key achievements in Islam. There's the development of Catholicism, or what we often think of as Roman Catholicism. Catholic means the whole church. So from a Catholic perspective, the church is what is under Catholicism. The separated brothers and sisters of Protestantism are accepted often by the official Catholic magisteria teaching, but ultimately the church is the Catholic, the whole church, the universal church. So around this time in the Middle Ages, there's the primacy, the key, the first among equals of the Bishop of Rome, who becomes the Pope, or is the Pope. So there used to be bishops for each of the regions. Now the Bishop of Rome becomes the key bishop. There's the split between the East and the West in 1054, which becomes the split between Orthodoxy in the East, Eastern Orthodoxy as it's known, like the Serbian Orthodox Church or the Russian Orthodox Church, and then in Christianity, the Catholic Church. The later split will be around 1517 when the Protestants split off with the initiation of many, but Martin Luther being one of the keys. Thomas Aquinas in the 1200s becomes a leading medieval theologian in the Catholic Church, again before the split from Protestantism, by integrating the insights of the philosophy of Aristotle with those of religious texts from Christianity. Then there's also the growth of what's called the cult, or the worship, or the veneration of the saints. The saints are seen as intercessors between God and humanity, who are canonized after death in their holy life, and they were considered to go straight to heaven like the martyrs did, who were killed for their faith, and thus we have a development of purgatory. There's also the development of monasticism, and you'll see the picture of the medieval cloister, which is reconstructed in New York City, the Medieval Art Museum called the Cloisters. Monasticism develops from its earliest roots with the desert fathers and mothers from the end of the 2nd century who found themselves and their faith polluted by the way that the church was increasingly taking on the power of the world and the corruption of the world. So they wanted to create a new community that focused on prayer and devotion to God. And the key element really is the rule of St. Benedict, which was developed in the 6th century to define much of these monastic monos, these abiding communities. Monos is what it means to abide in Greek, together. There's a development of mysticism, the experience of a direct contact with God, which is similar to the Sufis that we've studied. Often reported these mystics' unusual experiences. You see the statue of Bernini, of St. Teresa in mystical experience with the light of heaven actually penetrating her, is what she says. Hildegard of Bingen in 1141 says this: "And it came to pass, when I was 42 years and 7 months old, that the heavens were opened, and a blinding light of exceptional brilliance flowed through my entire brain." And they wrote these amazing texts, Hildegard being one of them. Or Meister Eckhart from the next century, who wrote this, which sounds almost a little bit pantheistic, that God is everywhere, not the transcendent God of Western religion. "Whoever possesses God in their being has him in a divine manner, and he shines out to them in all things. For them all things taste of God, and in all things it is God's image that they see." So there was mysticism, there was also the growth of monasticism, but there were problems with the papacy. For example, the Great Schism. I show you a picture here of when there was this Great Schism where there were two popes. One was in Avignon, France, southern France. This lasted not just a day or a week or a year, but from 1378 to 1415. And leading up to what we know as the Reformation, which began in the 1500s, there was a corruption in the papacy. And just one example, there was Alexander VI, who openly flaunted his reputation as a great lover. Get this, he put a portrait of his mistress, dressed up like Mary, the mother of Jesus, painted over his bedroom door. And he publicly acknowledged his ultimately famous children, Caesar and Lucretia Borgia. So this was a problem. The papacy was corrupt. And when Martin Luther looks at the medieval church and wants to support it, he's also horrified when he discovers how corrupt Rome is, and particularly the Rome as the seat of the papacy. Also, the papal power, which had controlled so much of Western Europe, was gradually diminishing because the growth of nation states, by which I mean like today that would be like Germany or France. They were moving away from the power of the Holy Roman Empire. In Judaism also we see this growth of mysticism as in Christianity and Islam. One major form is Kabbalah, which has roots in the 12th and 13th century and often is called the soul of the Torah. It gives insights into God's essence, God's interaction with the world, the purpose of creation, and has some similarities with the Gnostic interpretations of the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible. Growth in Jewish philosophy, for example, the great Moses Maimonides, who lived from 1135 to 1204 in this circle of engagement in Cordoba, Spain, from this prominent Jewish family. He worked with Christian and Muslim leaders like the philosopher Avicenna, and he taught he wrote his famous book Guide for the Perplexed, which attempted to bring Judaism in line with Neoplatonic philosophy and Aristotle's philosophy as taught by the well-known philosopher, as I mentioned, Avicenna. He was also trained as a physician and a rabbi and became a royal physician to the king of Egypt. I want to move into the Reformation and the scientific revolution. And you think about life on the ground before the Reformation begins in 1517. The German reformer Martin Luther inherited a complicated world when he decided to become a monk in the 16th century. Great men and women sometimes can decisively shape the direction of their societies, but they are always operating in a rich historical context with lots of other forces and personalities in play. So think about the 1500s. We know this from our experience with the current pandemic, how disruptive it can be. Imagine that without science that we have today, medical science. So the social fabric was torn from the Black Death. Feudalism, where a serf would work for a knight above him, and the knight would work for the king, and so on. Think Game of Thrones, if that rings a bell for you. It was under stress as cities and kingdoms were consolidating. Think about the universities that grew up originally to train priests. They conserved culture that connected regions. Empires in the church were trying to hold on to their power, and they did this by expanding into what was then known as the New World. And we see that in what I've said earlier. There's a fear of Jews and Muslims taking over and corrupting Christendom. There's this expansion, as I mentioned. There's the Bible, which is being translated for the masses. And then, finally, what you might call the internet of the 15th century, that printing is making materials to read more accessible. And into that walks Martin Luther, whose dates are 1484 to 1546, a German Augustinian monk who was just troubled by guilt and what he had not done. And in a famous experience, the Tower experience, in the tower of a castle, he experienced God's justification, freedom from guilt, and freedom by God's grace, not by what he did, his works, but by God's grace. And so he emphasized a personal, direct relationship with God in this freedom of grace. And he attacked these teachings, the indulgences. So the development of purgatory in the medieval Catholic Church, that meant that between dying and going ultimately to heaven, there was a purgation, a cleansing, which could last shorter if someone prayed for you, especially a particularly holy person, or somebody demonstrated their faith by giving money to the church. As soon as a coin in the coffer clinks, a soul from purgatory springt. That's what the German monk Johannes der Tetzel said. Well, Luther hated this because he found that indulgences put basically a taxation on the poor. It was a taxation to build great cathedrals like the Cathedral of St. Peter's in Rome, and he attacked him and posted with 95 ideas or statements or theses on the door of the Church of Wittenberg, Germany. And that initiated the Reformation. Ultimately, he started something that, in my view, is not clear whether he wanted to have happen, but a protesting church moved against the power of Rome. He also believed that the Jews who did not believe in Jesus as Messiah would turn ultimately to the Christian faith when it was purified in the Reformation. And he got angry that they did not, and taught a marked anti-Semitism, which we have to take in as a part of the culture that was within Europe for sure, and then many have argued echoed down to the days of Hitler. But anyway, Luther wrote this: "What shall we do with this damned, rejected race of Jews, since they live among us, and we know about their lying and blasphemy and cursing?" And in Geneva, Switzerland, a somewhat younger leader, John Calvin, whose dates are 1509 to 1564, systematized the emergent Protestant theology in his Institutes of the Christian Religion. He was born in France, but spent most of his life in Geneva. And he became the most influential theologian of the Reformation, founding a theology based on the Bible alone, in Latin, sola scriptura, that there was salvation by grace through faith, that it wasn't what we do in our works, but that we rely on God's grace, sola gratia, grace alone, sola fide, faith alone. Calvin worked this theology with rigor of a legal mind. He was trained as a lawyer and figured that if we really can't do anything for our salvation, if it really is God's grace, then God has to, if there is hell and heaven, God chooses, predestines some to heaven and to hell. And then you have the great emergence of modern science. I've mentioned these people before. Nicholas Copernicus, who presented the hypothesis of the heliocentric universe. This was against Aristotle's cosmology, which was geocentric or earth-centered. There was Galileo Galilei, who went head-to-head with Catholic Church authorities in 1633, was punished for his heliocentric hypothesis, for presenting the heliocentric hypothesis of Copernicus. You see him at his trial with the Inquisition, a rendering of that from 1633, and he was put under house arrest for teaching that the earth revolved around the sun. This was a complicated argument, and it's worth saying that it wasn't entirely science versus religion, because the best scientists of the day were in the church, in the Catholic Church, and Galileo retained his Catholic faith throughout his life. He named his daughter Marie Celeste, Marie of the heavens, you might say, who became a nun. But the Catholic Church, because of the way they understood the Bible, for example, when it says in the book of Psalms that the sun runs its circuit around the earth, that they took that not to be a symbolic image, but a realistic statement of what really is. They also had been basing themselves on Aristotle's philosophy ever since Thomas Aquinas, and since Aristotle taught that the earth was the center of the universe, they could not accept Galileo and did not believe he had entirely enough proof. In fact, he didn't have enough proof in terms of the tides. His theory of the tides was wrong, but of course we know Galileo ultimately wins out because, simply put, the earth does revolve around the sun. And then you move into the great Isaac Newton from 1642 to 1727, who wrote his Principia, Principles of Natural Philosophy, in 1687, and established a way to look at the heavens, what we call space today, with the same physics as Earth. In other words, in Aristotle's idea, the Earth was a lesser reality than the heavens, and so they had different physics. Aristotle only had physics, in his opinion, for the earth. Newton says, no, we can bring them all together under my simple laws of motion. So we see here this rise in science in the Western culture. And why did this exist? We've already seen it did arise with in Islam, but here it's a sustained rise, which has been called the scientific revolution. And it is, as scholars have looked at this, at least in part because there's the doctrine or teaching that God created the world, and so that the world is intelligible and has a law-like character. As Copernicus himself wrote, the universe has been wrought for us by a supremely good and orderly creator. A philosophy that sees the world as an ordered cosmos and not a chaos has been noted to be important for the rise of science. As the Berkeley Nobel laureate Charles Towns, who created the maser and the laser, wrote, "For successful science of the type we know, we must have faith that the universe is governed by reliable laws, and further, that these laws can be discovered by human inquiry." This takes us into the Enlightenment. So these overlap, the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. But the Enlightenment is often pulled out as a separate event from 1641 to 1781, you could say, from the point where René Descartes declared in his first meditations on philosophy in 1641 that I think, therefore I am. He doubted everything that he could he had in his mind, But then he realized that he could not doubt that he was a person thinking. And because of thinking, he existed. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. So this initiated the Enlightenment, which is focus on the power of human reason, the focus on the throwing off of self-imposed tutelage, which is what Immanuel Kant wrote in the end of the 1700s, and the freedom of the individual. Reason, autonomy, and individualism. In 1781, Kant himself brought about a reflection on the critique of pure reason, which showed the limits of what reason could do. And yet, for this almost 150 years, reason, the individual, and autonomy were the key elements of Western European life, at least among intellectuals. And it's important to note that Muslim countries have not undergone what has been called the Enlightenment project. So, and Muslims often see the Enlightenment as Western colonialism. So that's important. So when we ask why perhaps are Muslims less likely to have the kind of critical scholarship on religion that we find in Western countries, this might be one of the reasons. So again, I told you about these three things dating from 1641 to 1781, from Descartes to Kant: rationality, individualism, and in the middle of this of these three things, these three foci, there is autonomy, which is important for understanding the U.S., which was informed on Enlightenment values.